As Paul mentioned, with this book, Women versus Feminism, it came out October the 17th, and October the 21st, Me Too was suddenly all over the headlines. So even though I haven't written explicitly about Me Too in the book, the broader issue of sexual harassment of women and issues around the gender pay gap, for example, are just never far from the news headlines these days. There always seems to be a story about women's situation in the world coming to the fore. Even just this week, we've had the story, I'm sure some of you may have heard of it, of the 76-year-old male professor from King's College London in a lift at the Institute for some International Studies conference in Los Angeles, made the huge mistake of asking for the ladies' lingerie floor, and the female gender studies professor who overheard this was so exhausted by the sexism she has to confront on a daily basis, couldn't possibly have pulled him up for his weak joke there and then, and instead had to go and launch a formal complaint, and this has now made headlines around the world for a week. But each of these discussions, the debate around Me Too, the discussion of the gender pay gap, examples of weak jokes, are all used, as Paul suggested, to reinforce the notion that to be a woman today is to be disadvantaged, abused, objectified. And so you've got this narrative going on the one hand, that to be a woman is just hell, it's just terrible. And on the other hand, you've got reality. And the reality is that women are doing so much better today in every walk of life that often they're actually doing better than men. So women hold most of the most powerful positions in the country today. We have a female prime minister, female head of state, female head of the Metropolitan Police, female director of public prosecutions, female First Minister for Scotland, until very recently, female Home Secretary. But it's not just a few individuals in powerful positions that we can rattle off. For over 25 years now, for over a quarter of a century, girls have done better at school than boys. Women are going on to university in far greater numbers than men. This year, there are 55% of all young women have gone on to university, compared to 43% of young men. Now, if those statistics were reversed, if it was 43% of women going to university and 55% of men, my suspicion is that there would be a real outcry. There would be money put into investigations, inquiries. Why are so few women going to university compared to the numbers of men? Yet there may be a little bit of cursory wondering when it's the way around that it is, but there's no real outrage. It's not just in education that this success for women doesn't stop when they leave university. Today, 70% of women work outside the home, which is pretty much the exact same figure as men. 90% of female graduates work. And it's not the case that all these women are just doing little part-time jobs for a little bit of money to kind of pay for holidays or anything like that. Women are not just working, but they're entering the professions in far greater numbers than before. So more women than men now work as accountants, as vets, as doctors, and as lawyers. And yet we never really hear this story. This is not the narrative of success that makes newspaper headlines. Because women are working more than ever before, are entering the professions in far greater numbers than ever before, the gender pay gap has shrunk to a record low. So for women under the age of 39, and I'll come back and say why we're picking that as a particular age in a moment, but for women under the age of 39 today, the median hourly pay gap, so that's comparing like for like, people who are working the same jobs, the hourly rate of pay, the gap between men and women is under 2%. It's negligible, it's under 2%. So for women today, especially for younger women, I don't think they can truly be said to be oppressed in any meaningful sense of the word. But this is not to say everything's perfect for women. I do think, and this is where we come back to the kind of 39, 40 age that I was talking about, there is a generational legacy that still leaves its mark. So women first started going to university in greater numbers than men in 1992, as that was the year I went to university, just coincidentally. So women older than me, I would say, did face real problems, discrimination, and practical concerns such as finding childcare, that did hold them back. And this generational legacy does still play out today. But there's a delight in saying, I'm sure this is something that most of you will have heard, it's something which is often thrown at me, oh, but there are more men called John who run FTSE or lead FTSE 100 companies than there are women. So like all my statistics are completely wrong, because don't I know there are more men called John than women running these top companies. To me, that says far more about age than it does gender. I mean, you can all correct me if I'm wrong afterwards, but personally, I don't know any man under the age of 45 who's called John. CEOs are, unsurprisingly, likely to be older men because they embarked upon their careers when women did have far fewer opportunities. And any career that requires a couple of decades to work your way up, accruing experience, taking different promotions, is likely still to be dominated at the highest echelons by men who, unsurprisingly, are then paid more for being in those positions. So this goes some way towards explaining the average gender pay gap that we still see nowadays. But it seems that rather than telling our daughters, so my 12-year-old daughter, the kind of message that I want to be able to give to her is how wonderful to be young and to be a woman today, that there's a world of opportunities waiting for you. Go out there, grasp all these opportunities that you've got. But it seems that instead of telling that to young women nowadays, instead we try harder and harder to find more obscure sites of oppression. So the off-taste joke made in a lift. Who cares that somebody said ladies' lingerie in a lift? I certainly don't. I can't say that those two words kind of oppress me to any great extent. So we search harder and harder to try and find examples that we can hold up and say, oh, look, women are still oppressed. And we choose to tell that to our daughters instead. So the starting point of any debate on women's lives today, which, as we've said, comes up all the time, seems to be that women are still oppressed. Occasionally this might be questioned, but the questioners are often written off as being irredeemably male or old, or the thing that I've been told more than once is suffering from internalised misogyny. I'm obviously so full of self-loathing, and this is the only reason why I might have questions to ask of the direction feminism today is taking us in. One thing that concerns me, and I think it comes up in this accusation of an internalised misogyny, one thing that concerns me is that there seems to be a growing generational divide in attitudes towards feminism nowadays. So some of the most vocal critics of Me Too that I'm sure you'll have heard of, people such as Germaine Greer, Catherine Deneuve, Anne Robinson, Anne Leslie, are from an older generation. Whereas a younger generation of women, people like Jessica Valenti, Laura Bates of Everyday Sexism fame, Kate Maltby, are at the forefront of the Me Too movement. And anyone who has spent any time on social media will be well aware of a very, very ugly nature of this generational divide. It sometimes seems that there's no insult too offensive that it can't be levelled at a second wave feminist. And this is not just on social media. In The Guardian too, it seems to be quite acceptable to describe Me Too's older critics as having been lobotomised. So I appreciate that this very polarised and heated debate isn't representative of all women. I know plenty of younger women who are critical of Me Too, and plenty of older women who are fully supportive of the current direction in which feminism is heading. But there does seem to be some kind of new and bitter divides in feminism. So on the one hand, you've got younger women who argue that they're not prepared to tolerate the sexism that they accuse older women not only of silently putting up with, but also actually colluding in sometimes. And social media obviously provides a powerful outlet for these women to have their kind of collective voice heard. I do share sympathies with the older feminists in these debates, because I do think they're perhaps more appreciative of the gains that women have made. So we do know, and again this comes back to the generational issue and the divide that I was talking about earlier, within living memory women were unable to work at some jobs once married or pregnant. They were unable to initiate divorce proceedings or take out a credit card without a man's permission. And in this context, I think the risk of a clumsy come-on or a hand on the knee actually needs to be seen as a hard-won right. You know, the right to be in that situation, the right to be able to flirt, the right to be able to have that freedom to take part in those conversations, to be in that situation. It takes us a world away from, to go back a couple of decades even earlier, the world of chaperones, of curfews, of restrictions on women's freedom. And my concern with feminism today, or one of my concerns with feminism today, is that we're throwing away the gains of the sexual revolution far too easily. We're forgetting a kind of historical amnesia for what life was like for women before the sexual revolution. Some of the older women who have criticised Me Too, I think, are perhaps concerned that the progress women have made could be reversed, even though the restrictions and the demand for protections for women nowadays seem to come from feminists rather than patriarchal fathers. And it's this idea, the idea that if we want to fight for women's continued freedom to risk even, and this I know will sound horrific, but I actually think it's an important right to defend, the right to risk being raped, the right to be able to walk down the street on your own, in dark, in the evening. You know, that right, I think, is a fundamental human right. It's an important right of women's liberation that we should have the freedom to be able to do that. And if we want to defend that freedom nowadays, the freedom to even risk being raped, I think that in order to be able to do that, it puts me in opposition to feminists nowadays rather than the patriarchy. I don't have any patriarchal men trying to restrict what I do nowadays or trying to protect me. It's feminists, younger feminists, who try to protect me today. And it's this idea that we need liberating from feminism that gave me the title for my book. So my argument, in brief, is that by all material measures, any statistical measure you choose to think of, there's never been a better time to be a woman. And I don't mean this just as a kind of Pollyanna-ish, foot-stamping insistence that everything's perfect. There are still issues that concern women today, and I don't just mean generational legacies. I think particularly the experience of motherhood, the peculiarly intense way that motherhood is approached nowadays, with mothers in particular, it seems, being held entirely responsible for everything that happens, with determining their child's every life chance, I think creates a particular intensity around the experience of motherhood. But I think many of the problems that women do face today, things like insecure jobs, expensive and cramped housing, they actually share with men, and they're far better at finding solutions to those problems, working alongside men rather than pitched against men. In the second part of my book, I try to offer a critique of contemporary feminism. And my argument here is that feminism has essentially become a very elite preoccupation that can exploit the problems faced by working class women to allow already privileged women to present themselves as victims in need of special dispensations and protections. And my argument is that this does no one, least of all women, any favours. I think one thing we forget is how new feminism is as a label. So neither the suffragettes nor the original founders of the women's liberation movement in the 1960s described themselves as feminist, at least not at first. Feminism was just one particular position adopted by certain groups. And the term second wave feminism was first used in 1968, and it was from there that it was widely adopted. And in the space of just 50 years, feminism has moved then from describing a small group of activists in the women's liberation movement to a moral, political and intellectual orthodoxy. So we've had the spectacle, I'm sure you all remember it, just 2 or 3 years ago now, of politicians of all persuasions donning T-shirts, queuing up to be photographed in T-shirts declaring this is what a feminist looks like. And to me, that really sums up feminism today. So where feminism was once a challenge to the status quo, whereas once it was a really radical blow, or posed a radical blow to the establishment, today feminism is the status quo. Today feminism is the establishment. And at the very point that feminism began to take off, going back to the beginning of the 1970s, feminism also began to fracture. Differences emerged between liberal, socialist, radical feminists, Marxist feminists, lesbian separatists, women of colour, and so on. So yeah, I'm quite well aware that there are, we could say, 50 shades of feminism. Whenever I offer a critique, people never tire of pointing out to me, oh, but that's not the real feminism. And for those who kind of like the labels, I guess the feminism I'm primarily concerned with and the feminism I'm writing about in my book can best be described as intersectional or fourth wave feminism. But I think this also seems to be the feminism that fills Guardian columns, school assemblies on everyday sexism, national equal pay day campaigns. So I would argue that this is also now has become mainstream feminism. It's become the new feminist orthodoxy. And over time then, I think we've seen that mainstream feminism has changed, and I don't think it's changed for the better. And I want to just spend the rest of just further 5 minutes just exploring why I don't think feminism is at all useful or progressive. I don't think there's anything, certainly nothing progressive about it anymore. So I'm going to start by exploring a word that we don't hear nowadays, but was once central to feminism, and this is the word liberation. And my argument is that feminists today have abandoned liberation. They've abandoned the cause of liberation. Then I want to look at social class and argue that in pitching women against men, which is feminism's very raison d'etre, feminism ignores far greater social class differences that exist between women and between men. And again, as I've said, I think feminism today really represents the concerns of a very elite group of already privileged women and actually has little relevance to most women in society today. And I think one way of illustrating that is the fact that so few women describe themselves as feminist nowadays. If you look at national surveys, they suggest that around, well, some as few as 7, some maybe go up to about 15 or 20% of women describe themselves as feminist or would attach the label feminist to themselves. And one thing that always surprises me when these surveys are taken, when this comes to light, is that it never, or very, very rarely, seems to prompt reflection. Feminists never seem to stop and think, well, what is it about feminism that is not speaking to people today? Why? What are we doing wrong? Why are we not tapping into the concerns of more women? Instead, the tendency also always seems to be to blame women themselves. These women are so stupid, they're so ignorant, they're so suffering from internalized misogyny that they just don't see how right we are, which is interesting. Finally, I want to argue that today's feminism presents women as victims, at home, in the street, at school, in the workplace. And not only is this kind of dismal portrayal of women's lives false, it does women themselves no favours whatsoever. So if we go back 50 years, liberation, I think, was actually at the heart of feminism. And this was a time I think you could point to when feminism did represent something positive, the desire for liberation. And the women's liberation movement, as I've already suggested, emerged at a time when women's lives were very different from today, when they were formally barred from jobs, expected to give up work to become housewives and mothers, and as a result had very little financial independence, when abortion was illegal, when access to contraception was restricted, when women had very little control even over their own bodies. And the key demands of the women's liberation movement for equal pay, equal educational opportunity, for nurseries, for contraception, for abortion, were about enabling women to be free, to lead their lives in the same way as men did. Women didn't want to be restricted by their biology, by the law, by morality, by social convention. And I think the most progressive feminists at that time, the kind of best people, I think, within the women's liberation movement at that time, actually recognised that men as well could never be truly free while women were still oppressed, that liberation for women meant liberation for men too. And this feminism was less about pitching men and women in opposition to each other and far more about realising universal aspirations for liberty and equality. Since this time, and I think far too little credit goes to a previous generation of feminists, but since this time, women's lives have changed beyond all recognition. But as women's lives have changed, so too has feminism. And rather than campaigning around specific demands nowadays, like free childcare, abortion on demand, today's feminism tends much more to point at culture, at attitudes, at behaviour, at jokes, at adverts as the reason for women's continued disadvantage. And in this shift from arguing for material demands, changes to be made in society, to kind of pointing at culture, at song lyrics, at adverts, at jokes, at posters. In this shift, what you've got is calls for greater regulation. You've got calls for censorship of songs, of adverts to be banned, regulation of men's behaviour. So you've got Melanie On, Labour MP, calling in Parliament recently for street harassment of women to be banned. Now, very few people are going to stand up and say, yay, I'm really in favour of street harassment of women. But when you dig down and you look at what's the definition of street harassment, you know, this is a very subjective thing. It can be whistling, it can be any interaction between men and women, and you think, what's actually involved in criminalising this kind of behaviour? I mean, do we want a policeman on every street corner kind of with a microphone listening out for a random whistle? I mean, is that really progressive? And what are we saying about women if that's the case, that we kind of faint and quiver if somebody whistles at us, that we can't cope with this? So when we shift to culture, feminism focuses on the regulation of men's behaviour, and the other side of that coin is protection for women. So we see in this demand to censor adverts that are said to objectify or censor or stereotype women, calls for more regulation of the workplace, consent classes on campus. I mean, to be clear about my criticism of the Me Too movement, you know, it should go without saying, but I will say it because I know it's something I get pulled up on. Rape and sexual assault are obviously incredibly serious crimes, and they need to be treated very seriously. And as such, I think it's really important that they're dealt with in courts of law, not on social media. I think sexual harassment was once a useful description of very real discrimination that could take place against women in the workplace at times when they had insecure jobs and few alternative employment options. But today, the definition of sexual harassment has become expanded beyond all recognition. 28% of 16 to 24-year-olds apparently think that winking is a form of sexual harassment. So this is not to say that sexual harassment doesn't exist anywhere today. You know, I'm sure there are still unscrupulous bosses taking advantage of women, again, most likely women with few employment opportunities available to them. But sadly, the stories of such women, just like the experiences of teenage girls in Rochdale, Oxford and Newcastle, don't seem to attract as much feminist concern, or certainly do not seem to attract the Guardian column inches as the stories of well-paid journalists who may or may not have had their knee touched a decade ago. And I think we need to ask why. You know, why is feminism today more concerned about a journalist who may or may not have had her knee touched than it is concerned about working class girls? Sorry, just conscious of time. I think another problem is that the more we broaden out definitions of sexual harassment, we also run the risk of trivialising serious incidents of abuse. It moves us away from sexual harassment as a specific offence, and again it pushes us into the realm of men's bad behaviour. So I've been told repeatedly that knee touching is actually something that is a very serious crime. Maybe I just don't take it seriously because nobody's ever touched my knee. But I've been told that knee touching is something that needs to be taken, needs to be stamped out, you know, is a continual problem for women who have their knees touched all the time. And this is a very serious problem because it's all on a continuum of abuse, that if we let the knee touching go, then, you know, the next thing you know, someone will be raping you because we've legitimised the idea that women's bodies are objects, so we're condoning rape. But by that logic, every interaction between a man and a woman could be construed as being on a continuum with rape. I mean, if knee touching is on a continuum with rape, what about hand touching? Hand holding, hand shaking, hugs that last for 5 seconds rather than 3 seconds. You know, where do we draw the line? Where do we say this is not on a continuum with rape and this is on a continuum with rape? It seems to me that knee touching is on a continuum with something. It seems to me that knee touching is on a continuum with manspreading and mansplaining, examples of male behaviour that are now held up for public chastisement, where women, according to this narrative, are not only passive but blameless and beyond reproach, unable to tell a man to shut up, budge up, or remove his hand. The only option available to us poor women is, it seems, to run and tell all in a national newspaper column. Allegations of clumsy come-ons, unwanted attempts at kissing, I think reveal much about the shift in balance of the power of the sexes that has taken place over recent years. So men in theatre, journalism and politics have lost their jobs without trial by jury, but on the word of women who were automatically believed, applauded for their bravery in speaking out. But ironically, I think the widespread publicity and the influence of Me Too is actually a demonstration of the very power that women have today. The movement, the Me Too movement, if you like, and the global impact that Me Too has proves exactly the point. It proves women have the power they claim they are lacking. But not all women are powerful. And this is where I think that social class becomes an issue. Off the back of concerns about objectification of women, it's not just men, as I'm sure you're aware, who are losing their jobs today. Women too have also been put out of work. Women who have chosen to work at Formula One, at darts matches, or as hostesses at President's Club dinners have all lost their jobs in recent months. Few women in these jobs were complaining about the conditions of their work. Many, no doubt, calculated that they could make as much money in one evening working at a darts tournament as they could working in a call centre for a week. Yet middle-class feminists, many of whom are no doubt quite happy to have a woman cleaning their own homes, have deemed certain jobs unsuitable. So wearing a posh dress to a Formula One tournament is, these women have been told, degrading. Cleaning toilets in someone's house is not. I'm sure the women who worked at Formula One and darts are very grateful for having been put out of work. We do hear a great deal about women's pay today, as I've mentioned, but in all the discussions about the BBC presenters and CEOs, what's overlooked is that for the lowest paid men and women today, the gender pay gap is 0. If you have a minimum wage job, the minimum wage is paid to men and women alike. Now, the pay gap has shrunk considerably over recent years, and one of the reasons why it has shrunk is because men's pay has grown at a far slower rate on average than women's pay. Well-paid jobs for men without qualifications are scarce today. Pictures of highly paid female BBC presenters in equal pay t-shirts, snapped and Instagrammed in their posh kitchens, I think do the women and the men who work at Broadcasting House in cleaning, catering, administrative roles, no favours whatsoever. Now, this is not a plea to feel sorry for men. It's certainly not a plea to keep women out of work, but it's a bit to recognise that working class men and women, I think, are far better served arguing for higher wages alongside each other rather than against each other. I think working class women have far more in common with working class men than they do with the BBC presenters, than they do with Carrie Gracie. People are far better off fighting for their rights if they present themselves as strong and powerful rather than weak and vulnerable. So my very, very final point is that I think feminism today is obsessed with presenting women as victims. So whether it's stories about pay or sexual harassment, the insistence that women are abused, objectified, and disadvantaged in all aspects of their life not only doesn't match reality, I actually think it's very anti-women. It suggests women are fragile and vulnerable, can't cope with everyday life. It presents men, often all men, in the shape of a faceless patriarchy, as the cause of women's problems. And not only is this disingenuous, it erodes the possibility of men and women finding common cause. So when feminism focuses today on men's bad behaviour, the solutions proposed become increasingly illiberal. The target is often men, but the implication that women need protecting from words, from pictures, from jokes, from song lyrics is disastrous for women. It infantilises women. It puts us back in preschool with a nanny figure stepping in to take away all the bad things. I think the days of chaperones, of curfews, of segregated workplaces are not that far behind us, and I think we're really in danger of returning to them. I think feminism today is an elite project. It's concerned with regulating men and shoring up the interests of a group of elite and privileged women, and I think it's the very opposite of liberation.